Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine's Meet the Author event this evening. My name is Tracy McIntyre. I'm the lead educator at the museum, and I'm joined here by my colleague,
Melissa
Melissa.
Webb.
There we are. She is the Director of Marketing and Communications. And we are so pleased this evening to welcome Dr. Sarah J. Purcell as our Meet the Author. Sarah is the L.F. Parker Professor of History at Grinnell College in Iowa. She received her PhD from Brown University and is the author of 5 books, including the one we're going to discuss this evening, which is Spectacle of Grief, Public Funerals and Memory in the Civil War Era. So I'm very happy to welcome Sarah. She's going to give us a brief presentation about her book, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Take it away, Sarah.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here. I really enjoy giving these talks and interacting with everybody online. So make sure you get your questions ready or type them in the chat as they come up. And I'm just going to talk for a little bit as was introduced, and then we'll try to save most of the time for questions. Let me share my screen so that you can see that. That didn't share too well, now did it? Okay, let's try one more thing. I'm gonna try it one more time and then I'll wing it, I promise. Why did that not work now? Oh, can you see it or?
It says exit to full screen. So I think if you go to a different, it's
There we
showing,
go.
yeah, there.
There
If you
it
go to a
is.
different window, yeah.
There it is.
Try that again. Golly, everything's being cantankerous tonight. Why? Okay, I lied. I'm gonna try it one more time.
Yeah, I think it'll come through.
Yeah, it's very close. We can see the title page anyway.
Yeah, if not, we can see it in that format too, but
okay, well, we'll do it one way or the other, right? Okay. I'm very sorry for the delay. We did try this, everyone. We
did, and it worked.
We did, and it worked, believe us. There we go. There we go.
Aha! Is that it? Do you see it?
That is it.
Excellent. Okay. So I'm here to talk about my book, which came out in the spring of 2022. And you saw the actual physical book there, but here's the cover. It's called Spectacle of Grief, Public Funerals and Memory in the Civil War Era. It was published by University of North Carolina Press in 2022. I'll come back to this cover image in just a minute after I talk about it. This is the image that opens the book on the inside. The two images are actually from the same issue of Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, which you see here from March of 1874. And I use this image in the introduction to kind of set up the argument of the book and to give you a sense of the kinds of issues that the book gets into. And really just want to introduce you a little bit to my argument, which is basically to investigate the way that public funerals of major figures who were involved in the Civil War, other than presidents, that part is important, how their public funerals became a way for Americans to contest and agree upon and work through their issues with national identity, U.S. national identity, and also that public funerals were politicized and kind of a way for people to work through their issues in memory of the Civil War. And I'll talk about the span of the book. This book shows how that process worked. Many people are familiar with Abraham Lincoln's funeral or perhaps Ulysses S. Grant's funeral. And part of my point is to show how those were very impressive presidential funerals, very, very important. But what not a lot of people have focused on is the way that many other politicians, social activists, important figures in Civil War memory and in the Civil War itself also had funerals that were almost as large as Grant's or Lincoln's, and were quite significant and a way for people to contest politics. This Frank Leslie's is from the week of Senator Charles Sumner's funeral in Washington, D.C. in 1874. He died just before the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the final 1874 Civil Rights Act. And he was the fourth person to lie in state in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. His funeral was a very, very large outpouring of grief in newspapers and print culture. His body traveled from Washington, D.C. to Boston, Massachusetts, where he received public funerals in both cities. And this piece of print culture shows us how that worked. So we see here the mourning allegorical figure of Columbia placing the laurel wreath on Charles Sumner's coffin, with a flag with his face on it draped over it. And then around the foot of the coffin, you see a group of mourning Black men and boys who show the particular stake that Black people had in Charles Sumner's politics, as a representative of both abolitionism and then radical Reconstruction in the 1870s. And then you'll also see an angel of fame or an angel of memory, flying over the proceedings, and she's holding a tablet that says "Equal Rights for All." So the funeral and the public mourning, the mourning of the nation, literally in this picture, or allegorically in this picture, was a time for people to express their grief, not only for Sumner, but their concern about the political issues for which he stood. And it's not every individual for whom this was important. And so but those who merited this kind of mourning were very, very important. And that's what the book looks at. It looks at how newspapers and magazines and material culture like coffins and Black mourning fabric, and symbolism like angels, and the participation of everyday Americans like these Black men in this picture, and also competing political forces, from 1852, actually before the Civil War, until the turn of the 20th century, dealt with Civil War issues and Civil War memory. Now, I said 1852, which might seem slightly strange for a book about the Civil War, but in fact, the book starts with the funeral of Henry Clay. This is actually a photograph of Henry Clay's funeral procession in Lexington, Kentucky. It's amazing to have a photograph from 1852 from his funeral. Senator Clay died in 1852, as he was the longest serving U.S. senator at that point. And in the first chapter, he is the case study for how this level of public politicized funeral really got started. He was also the first American to lie in state in the U.S. Capitol. And he really set the trend, or at least expanded the trend set by George Washington upon his death, at the turn of the 19th century, for the kind of new technological age of the 19th century. His body traveled hundreds and hundreds of miles on trains, on steamboats, on carriages, and he had major, major funerals in many, many cities all throughout the North and the Upper South on his way from Washington, D.C. to his home in Lexington, Kentucky, where he was buried. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people went to pay their respects to Henry Clay. And so I both talk about this as a way to introduce the large-scale funeral, and also because symbolically Clay's funeral was very challenging. He was seen as the great compromiser, the architect of various compromises, especially the Compromise of 1850. And there was a thought that, okay, if Clay is dead, and if we mourn for Clay, maybe compromise is dead as well. And it marked a period of anxiety in the 1850s over the rising conflict towards secessionism. And so, excuse me, that's what I start with in the first chapter. The other thing is that each chapter in the book uses case studies of specific spectacle funerals, very large public funerals, in order to examine sectional issues, tensions over the Civil War and Civil War memory, and to look at how the United States was conceived of by large numbers of people. Clay is the only chapter in which it's a single funeral that is considered, because he was really seen as kind of both a northerner and a southerner, Henry Clay of the West. He was someone who represented different regional sensibilities across his career, and prior to secessionism, kind of set the pattern, especially also for Lincoln's funeral in 1865. So Clay starts off the book. The second chapter uses a pair of funerals, well, almost three funerals, but a pair of funerals. This for Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, one of the first major U.S. officers killed in the Civil War. It looks at the war years themselves and the way that memory of the Civil War started to be determined and started to interact with national identity during the war years. Elmer Ellsworth was killed as he removed a Confederate flag from the Marshall House Hotel in Alexandria, Virginia in May of 1861. He was shot by the innkeeper who you see on the right here, James Jackson, and Jackson was killed by Corporal Francis Brownell, who was one of Ellsworth's men. You'll notice, for instance, this is one of the many, many mourning engravings and visual images of Ellsworth, that he looks like he's about 10 feet tall in this picture from Courier and Ives, when in actuality he was about 5'3". This is his carte de visite. So it heroicized him into almost monumental proportions. Again, he received train travel of his remains from Washington. He had been Abraham Lincoln's law student. Train travel, huge fanfare across the North, public funerals in Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, on his way to rural New York where his body was buried. He also received, and this is an Alfred Waud pencil drawing, a funeral in the East Room of the White House. That is a distinct White House chandelier that you see there with the preacher, because he was a favorite of Abraham Lincoln's, and I explore his relationship to Lincoln. The contestation over Ellsworth and then James Jackson, the man who killed him, was one of the main early contests of Confederate versus Union mourning. And it couldn't happen over and over again by the time 600 or 700,000 men were killed in the war. Men were killed in the war and died of disease. But it showed the scale of mourning and kind of surprise at the beginning of the war. The second half of the chapter, Ellsworth, as the northern figure, is paired with Stonewall Jackson, who was killed a little bit later in the war, 1863. And mourning for Jackson was, in some ways, much smaller because of the vagaries of war in 1863 and the occupation of large areas of the Confederacy. And yet, his funeral in Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, was extremely important along the way, and his gravesite in Lexington, Virginia, became the focus of intense public veneration and lots of funeral celebration, including several of the earliest celebrations of Confederate Memorial Day. And you see here a member of a ladies' association, a Confederate Ladies Memorial Association, bringing wreaths to Stonewall Jackson's site. The next chapter looks at a pair again, Northerner and Southerner. The Northerner is an interesting figure, now much forgotten, but named George Peabody. And George Peabody was a very rich philanthropist who lived in Great Britain for most of his life. He was from Massachusetts, but he was a very important philanthropist and multimillionaire. And he was beloved of the English people, but also very much a staunch New Englander. And he had funded Southern institutions and education, and he had championed kind of a forgiveness of the Confederacy and a form of reconciliation. This is the funeral for him in Westminster Abbey in London, a very large-scale mourning, which was rarely ever lavished on anyone not British, let alone an important British subject. His body was then put on a warship and shipped over to New England, where he received huge public funerals and a burial. It became a ritual in which people examined and contested over the ideas of forgiveness, the reunification of the North and the South, and whether it was possible for the United States and Great Britain to make amends after the Great Britain had aided the Confederacy in a lot of ways. Peabody was also quite friendly and a benefactor of Robert E. Lee, who is the second figure in the second chapter, who died in 1870. This is a photo of the slightly historic. The flags are now not displayed there. At Washington and Lee College, Lee was president of then Washington College when he died, and he's buried beneath the chapel there. And mourning over Lee in 1870 was again a time when some Northerners started to accept Lee or extol him as a great Christian gentleman, even if they still saw him as somewhat traitorous, and Southerners to kind of, especially white former Confederates, to retake some of their former political positions. And I can talk a lot more about the pageantry of Lee's funeral. This one was especially contested in print culture and newspapers, and the site of Lee's death and the site of his burial was the subject, again, of pilgrimage and some contest between the city of Lexington, Virginia, and Richmond, Virginia, which wanted to also host his remains at the growing importance of Hollywood Cemetery. Then the following chapter, again, returns to Charles Sumner, who in a way, even though he was a radical Republican who championed Black liberty, as we saw in Frank Leslie's, he had also wanted to tamp down the sectional divisions of the Civil War and really wanted some kinds of enmity of the Civil War to be forgotten. And yet there was a great controversy over his attitudes after his death and a lot of outpouring of fear, especially by prominent Black preachers and Black politicians like Frederick Douglass, that without their most staunch white advocate in the Senate, that what would happen to the cause of Black freedom and voting rights and citizenship without Charles Sumner. The question of where Black leadership would come from hung over the 1870s. Douglass very much was concerned about that. And Sumner is paired with Joseph Johnston, the Confederate general, who also wanted a rather quiet funeral. Ironically, since he had served as pallbearer in many public funerals, he had unveiled many Confederate monuments and had kind of attended, had absolutely attended Union generals' funerals as a way to both extol the lost cause as part of the United States identity and as a symbol of reunification. So part of the point of this chapter is that nothing is very straightforward. Not all the time were these funerals able to just have one image of what the U.S. should be. They could be interpreted in various ways. And even though funerals are the time when you shouldn't speak ill of the dead and everyone should agree and you should have the most positive view of the person who died as possible, it is possible, it happened all the time, that those ideas were contested nonetheless during these large outpourings of grief. We can only think about recent politicized funerals, Jimmy Carter, Charlie Kirk. Like, we can see how funerals could be the subject of political contest. It's not hard to imagine that in our current day, but it was contest over the Civil War. The last chapter looks at two new kinds of figures. First, the actual funeral of Frederick Douglass, who had been one of the participants or critics of a lot of the previous funerals in the previous chapters. Douglass died, and again, it was seen as a great turning of the generations, an amazing time for people to debate the continued remembrance of his work for emancipation and Black rights, and also all the causes for Black liberty that he had continued to advocate into the 1890s. He didn't die till 1895. Such as anti-lynching, for instance. And you see here an example of the print culture and the material culture I was talking about, this piece of sheet music, the Frederick Douglass Funeral March, that people could buy and display and play the music in their parlors to be part of that. His funeral was in Rochester, New York, where he was buried with great fanfare, was also the occasion of the beginnings of the first ever public monument to a Black man, a Black person in the United States, the Douglas Monument in Rochester, where he was buried. And then he's paired with the Southerner. Well, it's funny because, of course, Frederick Douglass was actually a Southerner born in North Carolina. And then you'll see the second figure here, Winnie Davis. This is her grave, the daughter of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who was born in Richmond, Virginia during the Civil War, but largely resided in the North most of her life. So she was kind of the Northerner, he's kind of the Southerner, and vice versa in this chapter. She's interred next to her father in Hollywood Cemetery, and she was widely known as the daughter of the Confederacy, as she participated in Confederate memorial rituals. And then the organization, the Daughters of the the Daughters of the Confederacy, named themselves after Winnie Davis, and around the time of her death in 1898, just before that. Again, very unusual for a Black man and for a white woman, for any woman, to merit this scale of public mourning. And this was a change at the end of the century, that the rituals themselves could open up to honor new kinds of people, even if the political contest was somewhat familiar. So the whole point of the book really is to explore those kinds of issues. There's lots more I can say, and maybe you'll have questions about what do I mean by a public funeral? What did people do with them? But the idea is to look at them as political rituals that tell us a lot about what people valued about the Civil War and also about its memory and how they contested over that. So I think I will stop there. And I know that you have some questions and of various kinds. So ask away. I'll let you take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. Melissa, do we have any questions from our audience?
Yeah, great. We have a bunch of people on watching, and we want to encourage you, if you are watching and you have questions, to please put them in the comments, and we will try to ask as many of them as we can in the time that we have allotted. We do have some questions and comments already, so I'll try to piece together a couple of them. Of course, are very interested in the idea of the lost cause and Lee's ceremony or funeral and Davis's funeral as well. How much do you think, and this is a question that Tracy was kind of, we were talking about earlier too, how much do you think that these funerals really kind of perpetuated that lost cause idea? Was it successful? Did they actually have some success in creating that lost cause cannot
Yeah,
figure.
absolutely. And even starting with Stonewall Jackson's funeral during the war. I mean, no one was using the term the lost cause. For one thing, it wasn't lost yet. But there was a kind of, you almost call it like a proto-lost cause or a pre-lost cause, even as soon as Stonewall Jackson, because there was a thought, again, sort of like what I said with Henry Clay, but transferred onto the actual fortunes of the Confederacy in the war, which is, now that Stonewall Jackson has died, what will happen? Will the cause be lost? Like, that's the first note of the lost cause. And the veneration for Stonewall Jackson sets many of the themes of the lost cause that get started later. So a kind of tragic heroicism, and an emphasis on discipline and Christianity and Confederate nationalism, and as being a worthy cause, even if it can't be sustained. So the field is set even beforehand. That really accelerates, obviously, as the questioner asked about, with Robert E. Lee in 1870, and that's just as the lost cause itself is starting to get coined. Right. Yes, absolutely, it had a lot to do with that. Again, framing Lee as a Christian gentleman, framing him as someone who was kind of a figure of tragedy and yet had a spotless reputation in Confederate thought, and also efforts of his wife, his widow, Mary Custis Lee, to become the center of attention. So like the mourning widow, who mourned for the tragically lost husband. She was a big proponent of the lost cause. and a lot of organizations and individuals and churches and baseball clubs. I mean, you wouldn't believe, like tons of organizations wrote to her with these letters of condolence about how Lee's loss was, a great vacuum for public culture. But I mean, I always tell my students, in some ways, the best hero is a dead hero because they're not around to like mess up anymore or
Yeah.
to say anything, or they can become the figure of imagination. And so many of these funerals also then contributed to efforts to memorialize the figures. So the Edward Valentine Memorial of Lee on top of his grave was first proposed to be the first biggest Lee memorial, but very soon Richmond, another memorial association, got in on the act to make the very large public monument of Robert E. Lee in Richmond that was on Monument Avenue, and that was unveiled, several years later on Monument Avenue. And so you couldn't find a much bigger festival of the lost cause and focus of the lost cause than that. That really kicked off the first big era of the lost cause. And it all came out of the funeral celebrations, the funeral commemorations for Lee, and sort of like dueling memorial associations, the idea of collecting relics of the dead Confederates, symbols like draping Stonewall Jackson's coffin in the spotless banner of the Confederate flag in 1863. So the use of a lot of Confederate symbology that becomes very important in the Lost Cause. And certainly Winnie Davis, I mean, you can definitely see how it accelerated then, right? By the end of the 19th century, became something different, maybe with her generation. And then the focus on women's efforts to keep the Lost Cause going. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy did that very much, right, into the first part of the 20th century with memorial efforts, educational efforts. It was a very intentional spreading of the lost cause. And these funerals were moments that heightened that in a particular way, kind of put
Interesting.
fuel on the fire.
That makes sense. We also have somebody who's asking sort of a different question about Lincoln as well and the Reconstruction. And there are people this person is saying that sort of kind of contest and grab for his memory, many different fractions grabbing for his memory to talk about Reconstruction. Can you talk a little bit about how his memory was used in political ways as you're talking about here?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. So very much again, what I said about the departed hero is also true of the departed president in Lincoln's case. That
Yeah.
so people sort of folks on many different poles or different sides of Reconstruction thought about, well, Lincoln would have been more forgiving. He was kind of headed towards something of a forgiving. He was a sort of expansive in his inclusion of former Confederates, at least in the preliminaries to Reconstruction. But he probably wouldn't have gone all the way towards amnesty or the kind of open racism or I guess despising of Black rights that Andrew Johnson was for.
Right.
And so he definitely would have been more moderate, at least on racial issues, than Johnson had been. So it's hard to say. Part of it is we just don't know, right, what he would have done. But his funeral, the thing about his funeral was that it was his funeral was also like truly huge, right? All these different cities, the train would stop, people would look on his face. All of that had happened even with Elmer Ellsworth. But this was the assassinated president. And it did, on the one hand, kind of solidify national grief at the end of the war. People had a chance to. That's another thing that happened with these funerals is people worked through their personal grief and their family grief by mourning for these large figures. And that's very true for Lincoln, but perhaps also solidified a certain amount of Confederate grievance and help to silence that in public culture and kind of tamp it down. So in terms of Reconstruction, I think, for instance, some parts of radical Reconstruction wouldn't have been as possible to pursue without Lincoln there as the ultimate example of the bloody shirt. But also mourning for Lincoln couldn't cover up all the other political debates and couldn't cover up Andrew Johnson. So like Lincoln's absence made Johnson's presence possible, and that makes it a little bit complex in his case. So it's even more complex when it's the president, I guess.
Yeah. Something you touched on was with the idea of these, like the pageantry again with these funerals. We have somebody asking a question about given this sort of Victorian fascination with death, and of course, because it's much more present in people's lives at that time, it's not all the children that are dying, how much more easily people die, at that time, without the cures that we have today. Do you feel that the pageantry and the idea of funerals is much more of a part of life at that point than it is versus today's life?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was in a way. So the death was more ubiquitous, kind of present in people's lives, as the questioner is asking. People were more accustomed to, encountering the bodies of their dead loved ones, or, postmortem photographs. There's been a lot of scholarship on that sort of thing. And yet the Civil War was very challenging. The scale of death, right, was unlike anything that had come before. And so I think the scholars debate this, right? The everyday nature of death and the spectacular scale of death in the Civil War. And I think both are true. It is true that people experienced death in a different way than we do today. It's also prior to the wide-scale commercialization of the funerary industry, and there weren't very many undertakers of the variety they were known as undertakers. There certainly weren't funeral directors, so what we see here, however, is the Civil War causes it's a shift in that's happening during the war, during and immediately after the war, because so many people died, and because this war death was so large that it violated, the notion of the Victorian good death, where people had a resolution, they were able to say prayers and kind of have their loved ones close by. When you have, in some areas, 1/10 the population, 25% of men of like adult men are killed in many areas. It's probably even higher in parts of the Confederacy. That is a huge absence, and those people weren't able to be mourned. I mean, Drew Gilpin Faust has written about this a lot, right?
Yeah.
That it was a very anonymized death. They weren't even counted, right? There are lots of ways that it kind of changed the federal apparatus, but it also changed the culture around death in a way. And so what we also see then is the beginnings of the creation of the commercialization of death. And I see that even in the 1850s with Henry Clay. I wrote actually an article. It's not all of this is in the book, but some of it is about Henry Clay's coffin, believe it or not. And the manufacturer that made Henry Clay's coffin, which was very specific, but it was a Fisk's patent coffin, and it was a cast iron coffin that was hermetically sealed, and it's made on the form of a Egyptian sarcophagus. And the idea was that, and he was not embalmed. This was prior to embalming being widely practiced. That happened during and after the war. That's
Right.
another aspect of this transition. So his coffin, which traveled, as I said, around the country, and people looked at it, and for a while they like moved the faceplate so people could look at his face, but it was hot and it was not as hermetically sealed as they thought it would be. So they stopped opening the faceplate at a certain point. It was not working so well. But the Fisk company that made the coffin advertised all over the country, get your Fisk patent coffin, go down to the furniture store in Cincinnati. You can go to the Undertaker in Pittsburgh. You can go in New York City and get the coffin that preserved Henry Clay. And they had little testimonials and you can think about this as like modern marketing. It's
Yeah.
very different than what came before. Even in the 1830s, you would not have seen this like commercial. In fact, the New York Times had an editorial where they're like, surely this is crass commercialization. I mean, interestingly, it is the kind of business that Henry Clay, as a Whig, supported commercial activity. But it's almost funny to us that like Henry Clay's coffin would be seen as this kind of commodities. So it's a transition point from the very personal funeral to a more commercialized funeral, with the absolute like I don't know, skewing factor of the huge scale of Civil War death. So it really is the thing that helps to change both American culture, but especially culture around death, I think. So it's an inflection point.
Interesting. We have a little question here too, and people wondering, you talked a little bit about what people expected from funerals. Was there a trend at the time, or was it a practice at the time for people to specify their funeral arrangements before they died?
Sometimes, yeah, for especially for famous figures, it
Okay.
was not that unusual for people to make requests. And actually, one of the things that I get into in a couple of cases is, however, no one, even the most famous, mostly were not able to control what, I mean, you could control what you want for your own funeral. You might be able to control what your family requests for the actual ceremony, but the wider mourning and the rituals that go around, the newspaper coverage, the traveling of the body, you can't actually control that necessarily. One of the most interesting cases of that is actually General Joseph Johnston, who as I said, wanted a relatively quiet funeral, and he didn't want any Confederate symbols, which is interesting because he was very into the lost
Yeah.
cause at times. But he didn't want, he requested no uniforms, for instance, in the church during his funeral, and he didn't want anything. Nonetheless, the forces by then of the lost cause in the late 1880s, they were not happy to let that go. And in fact, they kind of protested. They let his body get buried. They kind of followed the body along the train, and sort of the Sons of Confederate Veterans like stood to the side. They weren't allowed to do much with the actual remains. And then immediately they started having celebrations in his memory, in his honor. The Lee Post of Sons of Confederate Veterans, like they were right there, ready to have it. They collected his relics for the new Confederate Museum in the so-called Confederate White House in Richmond. They like threw all the lost cause symbols at it, even though he didn't want that for the actual funeral. So it's not always possible for people to kind of control their own fate. Not everybody made their own arrangements. I mean, Henry Clay didn't say he wanted to be paraded around in various places. And it took different ones are arranged in different ways, sometimes by government entities, sometimes by political clubs. As the century wore on, the family is more important, but there's precedent even for that. I mean, so for instance, the precedent for much of this was George Washington's funeral, as I mentioned. And when George Washington died, I mean, they were creating the United States Capitol. There's still an empty crypt right beneath the rotunda that was intended to be for George Washington, but Martha Washington and George himself didn't want to have him buried there. And so he was returned to Mount Vernon, where he was buried and then reburied later in a second tomb. Same for Lincoln. So some people had the thought, well, we'll put Lincoln in the Washington crypt. Nope. Mary Todd Lincoln did not want that either. So the person's own wishes and the family's wishes often have an influence, but it only extends so far.
Interesting.
Interesting. Well, I'll let Tracy ask a couple questions. She had definitely had some that she wanted to start off with too. So
Okay,
come
well,
back to-
let's start off with a real general question, and that is, how did you get the idea for this book?
That's almost a pun, and you didn't even know it. The general question.
The general question.
So I mentioned George Washington. So one of my previous books is called Sealed with Blood, and it was about the public memory of the Revolutionary War. And in that book, that came out in 2002, in that book, funerals played a role in the memory of the Revolution. Public funerals, public mourning for officers like Joseph Warren or Richard Montgomery. And then George Washington's funeral that I've mentioned a few times was a very large for the 1790s, a very large cultural moment. Lots of mock funerals and many funeral sermons, hundreds of funeral sermons preached for George Washington around the country. So I paid attention to that. And then and so that was a part of my previous work on general commemoration. I became increasingly interested in Civil War scholarship over the years, and it was kind of shifting to work more on the Civil War. And then I just kept running into it. I was looking at primary sources and kept running into the scale of the funeral. I mean, Henry Clay's funeral is many times larger than George Washington's funeral. And then again, as I said, many of us know about Lincoln's funeral, right? So I knew about Lincoln. And then the more I got into it, the more I was like, well, wait a minute, there are all these other funerals. So somewhere between George Washington and Lincoln, there are all these other things. And I was very interested as a scholar of memory in the memory of the Civil War and all the historiographical debates and cultural debates about that memory. And it's kind of unusual to find an angle onto Civil War scholarship that has been less explored. And so my interest in it's not necessarily that I'm a very macabre person. I'm not super into death myself, but it was a way to examine Civil War memory in a way that was really important to people at the time, that had been talked about a little bit over here and a little bit over here, but putting all those pieces together, the political tradition, the funeral, and the cultural meaning of death and the memory of the Civil War. So it kind of came out of my previous work and just working in archives and looking at sources and following where they took me.
Interesting. Okay.
Interesting.
You have any?
Somebody was asking about that too, your motivation, and I was kind of wondering as well. How did you choose who to include in the book and who not to? I'm sure you
Yeah,
ran
that's
into a lot
Yeah,
of
that was my
stories
next
that-
question.
Yeah,
My students ask me that too. So part of it is I just say, well, okay, I did think a lot about should I do Grant and Lincoln, should I not? It just kind of worked out better not to,
yeah,
because I wanted to make the point that other people had this, they're referred to quite a lot in the book, but not the case studies. Um, on the one hand, I just researched the heck out of it, and these were the biggest, most important ones. And they were ones that were able to talk about certain moments in the evolution of Civil War memory and the contests over memory and politics. So they are both. I had to look at 30 other funerals in order to make sure that many of which were quite
sure.
large. I mean, I don't know, the Grimke's, for instance, Grimke sisters, for instance, or there's many other people I looked at, Turner Ashby, like there are important public funerals, but weren't as important to the arguments about national identity. So other funerals were important public rituals or important in a certain region, and these are ones that transcended just being about a particular region and were commented on in the whole country by many, many different people and had this level of contestation. And so it's just a matter of really doing the research to make sure. I think you could write a different book and you could probably look at some other funerals, and maybe people will do that. I mean, I think now that I'm not the only one, but a few other people are paying more attention to this public mourning and particularly these politicized funerals. You could make a different point about politics with different funerals, perhaps, but they're not the ones that were as national as the ones that I'm examining.
That answers the question I had.
Great.
Excellent.
I'll let you go, Tracy. I'm still writing notes here. So
Okay, sure.
You guys
Okay.
tag team very well.
Yeah.
So, carrying it forward, I mean, this book really had me thinking a lot, and I love books that make me think. So I was thinking about carrying it forward in history. Would you consider the funerals of JFK and RFK that were modeled on Lincoln's funeral and occurred during the civil rights era to be part of an attempt at consensus building between whites and blacks?
I mean, yes, I think to a certain degree, for sure they were. And yet, um, you could see, I think even, I mean, even the growth of conspiracy theories, for instance, might be something that not necessarily about racial issues, but shows that they were contested in their own 20th century way, right? In their own and the contestation always tells you more about the moment of the funeral rather than the actual work of the person in some cases, right? But I think that's true. And if you just look at the visual culture of JFK's funeral, the actual political capital to maybe pass civil rights legislation. It might be kind of similar to Charles Sumner's death in a way, of like carrying forward the political capital and the like resolve of the remaining politicians to go ahead and pass the civil rights bill, for instance, in the 1960s, very similar to the 1870s. Luckily, until recently, it's of course a different story in terms of the longevity and the robustness of the Civil Rights Bill in the 1960s versus the 1870s. But that has more to do with the Supreme Court. But I do think the people who have been through, people who remember those funerals, people who can remember a variety of other public funerals, Princess Diana's funeral, for instance,
Yeah.
or some funerals for 9/11, like that level of national outpouring of grief is always something that people can use to contest issues that are important to them. It's a little bit delicate because you don't want, again, you have to maybe not tread. Sometimes overt respect for the dead tries to get people to kind of paper over difficult rifts in society. But it didn't always work. And even in the 1870s, 1860s, there were people like Frederick Douglass willing to say, as he said, the nation is crying crocodile tears over Robert E. Lee, and I'm nauseated at the excess of
Right.
crying over this traitor. So like he was willing to call it like it is, and I think that's also true in the 20th century. So
Right. Good point. Good point.
Yeah, we have somebody that's actually made that comment in the comments as well about this sort of outcry about some of the political use of some of these
yes.
funerals.
And there's also a stream, I haven't mentioned this, but similar thing of well, I guess I kind of talked about it in the New York Times with that Henry Clay's coffin thing, but that some people who criticize the outpouring of grief itself as being excessive, that it's too much and we're spending too much money, and maybe it's like a little bit too much like a party, or it's too much like a festival, rather than any kind of sincere act of mourning. And I think as I said, this was a big time. In the 19th century was a time of technological transition, commercialization, the use of the telegraph, and all of that is just magnified in the 20th century with the use of television and radio, and then
Sure.
magnified again now with the internet, where it's like just instantaneous, right? The memification of mourning rituals and things like that. So there are some folks who were kind of countercultural all along, saying, "Oh, this is just excessive." But even now, those folks tend to be in the minority. Like you don't really make very much political hay by saying, "Oh, we should just quiet down." Like no more mourning. That doesn't tend to work very well, because I think it takes a natural human element, something that is part of American culture and religion, and then uses it for political purposes. And you can't just tell people, "Oh, just forget all of that." That it's pretty baked in at this point.
Hmm. Yeah, good
Yeah.
point.
You said also that there was a bit of a change, of course, because of the way that death changed during the Civil War and the way that people experienced their grieving now. And there wasn't the same affording, this sort of pageantry or funerals at all. Can you talk a little bit about how those rituals changed because of the Civil War? How did the funeral ritual or pageantry or the way people, finished grieving or
Yeah.
did this?
Well, probably one of the most notable is the rise of embalming. So that it started even during the war. So Elmer Ellsworth, for instance, was embalmed, and his embalmer actually made a again made a career of like advertising himself as the man who embalmed Elmer Ellsworth.
Right.
And that was very early use of embalming. Abraham Lincoln was famously embalmed, right? And same for his embalmer. Um, because so many soldiers had been buried in mass graves, unmarked graves of various kinds, their bodies were often then moved to national cemeteries. There was a big effort for mostly for Union soldiers, but also for some slain Confederates to be reinterred after the war. But the rise of embalming was really about, okay, let's preserve the body. It's not that we're going to bury the body ourselves anymore, or we're going to have necessarily a wake in our home or have the body on ice. But if we employ an embalmer, if we employ a funeral service, we can take part in the culture of mourning, but we can actually preserve the person's body. And even if it has to be moved across country, we'll still have it and we'll be able to see that person in the same way. Or even if a lot of people are killed. And the other thing there is like the rise of dog tags. Like there was no personal identifier that was guaranteed on people on soldiers' bodies during the Civil
Right.
War, and so making soldiers identifiable was something that was thought of after this. Something that scholars argue about World War One, the scale of death and the personalization, the kind of democratization of soldiers had that effect in Europe, but the Civil War really did it in the United States.
Somebody is asking too, sort of about these consequences that we keep talking about. Did you come across any, could you talk a little bit or comment about unintended consequences that you might have found? A lot of this is politically shaped on purpose, but did you find any really unintended consequences
Oh,
of note? Yeah.
there are always huge unintended consequences in history for sure. No, and again, like I said, nobody could control, like lots of people
Yeah.
couldn't control a cultural phenomenon once it got going. Yeah, there are lots of unintended consequences. One of the most dramatic would be in Frederick Douglass's funeral. So Frederick Douglass's funeral actually ends up being, and his death ends up being a tool for white supremacists in some parts of the country. Some folks argued that Frederick Douglass, this is almost like belies the imagination, but that Frederick Douglass was a great white man, and the reason he was a great American is that he was half white and that he wasn't a great black, even though like racial laws and convention, everything, right? He was formerly
Yeah.
enslaved, like
Right.
none of that mattered. That okay, it was fine to pay him tribute, and he must be impressive because he was actually white. His father was an enslaver, so his mother's enslaver. He thought so. That picks up steam, and there are people who are like social Darwinists and racial theorists of white supremacy who argued that Frederick Douglass was a great white man. And then not only that, but so that's one way in which
Yeah.
that is a
Interesting.
hugely unintended consequence,
Yeah,
right, of
absolutely.
Frederick
Yes.
Douglass's funeral. And nothing that Frederick Douglass ever, there were some people of mixed heritage who did try to trade on having white ancestry. Douglass had none of that. He never was into that. So he would not have done that. The North Carolina legislature had a debate about what was proper. They thought to adjourn in Frederick Douglass's honor. They did adjourn in Frederick Douglass's honor as a famous North Carolinian. White supremacist Democratic political leaders had a backlash to that, and it is the whole controversy that I talk about in the book. And it ended up meaning that the North Carolina legislature funded the Confederate monument that was built at the state capitol. And so, unintended consequence, I told you that Douglass's mourning started the first memorial for a Black American, formerly enslaved man. It also helped to fund the Confederate memorial that has subsequently been taken down at the North Carolina state capitol. So, like controversy over the politicization of funeral rituals can go in multiple directions and directions that would seemingly oppose one another.
And it's
There's
sort of
lots
like
of other
what
examples, but that's probably the most shocking one.
Yeah,
yeah, I
that's
was gonna
pretty
say,
shocking.
yeah, that is really shocking. I was gonna say it's sort of like Joseph Johnston in a way too, because he probably wouldn't have wanted his funeral to be used for such as a big lost cause deal.
He didn't want it, although to me it's still a little opaque why he didn't want it, because
Yeah,
he took part in lots of other lost cause, memorials and statue unveilings, but he also liked reconciliation some of the time. So he was someone who kind of contained the contradictions within one person. Douglas was much more clear, in one direction. He
yeah,
he didn't have a he had a tiny bit of maybe personal forgiveness. He had visited his former enslaver and was somewhat in touch with their white descendants, which was noted at his funeral. They sent a flower arrangement to the church where his funeral was put. But I mean, that's like tiny compared to like any kind of like, let's he certainly was not a booster of white supremacy. Let's put it that way.
right, right.
Interesting. Um, I'll let you go, Tracy.
Oh, okay. I actually just have one more question, and that is, was there something that particularly surprised you during the course of your research, something that really stood out and you said, "Whoa, had
Yeah.
no clue about."
Wow, that's a great question. Well, I think that I should have saved
Yeah.
my Frederick Douglass thing because
That's a pretty shocking one.
that
Yeah.
certainly surprised me. There's a lot of things that were really surprising. Let's think about another. I think the maybe the George Peabody a funeral in Westminster Abbey, and then his being brought over. His body was brought on a British warship to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which had the only deep water port that could accept this like enormous British steam warship. And it was kind of a show of force by the British to repatriate his remains in this like special chapel. I mean, he was like a friend of Queen Victoria. He had received a gold medal from her and all sorts of things. And so of someone who, even to Civil War historians, was not like a very well-known figure now. This is someone who's largely forgotten, even though he was I mean, outside of certain little pockets of New England, Peabody, Massachusetts, they definitely remember him. That's where he's from. And there's lots of things named after him, including all over the North and the South, museums at Harvard and Yale and the education school at Vanderbilt, and like the same sometimes it's pronounced Peabody now, or the Peabody Institute, but it was Peabody. It is Peabody. So people don't think about who it's named after. So someone who is kind of forgotten now. Elmer Ellsworth is kind of forgotten now, but again, outside
Yeah.
of Illinois or certain parts of maybe in Alexandria, where for a while there's some memory of it. But it was a huge deal at the time. And to think about Anglo-American relations and warships and like all this angling over, the Prince of Wales came to the funeral in Massachusetts. So the scale of importance, some things we remember now and have maintained, like the lost cause, the Union cause, we remember those are still contested over, those are still important. And we remember Robert E. Lee and Frederick Douglass, but just because we don't necessarily remember Elmer Ellsworth and George Peabody, doesn't mean they weren't just as important in their time. And so it's kind of important to look at both the lesser known figures and some of the like really huge remembered figures, and to make sure we're always contextualizing it within the moment. So surprising, I think that George Peabody story, the more I got into it, the more and more detail there was, and like just how significant it was, as a story of reunification, both for the British and the Americans and for the North and the South within the United States.
Yeah, that really surprised me as well. I'm originally from Massachusetts, so
Oh yeah.
I'm very familiar with Peabody, that really did surprise me. I had no clue about the fact that he was so famous, and the fact that that was sort of used as a way of reconciling the
Yeah.
relations between the United States and Britain after the Civil War, since Britain was, supplying the Confederacy and
Yeah.
was kind of on the fence about do we support them or not. And I just found that was one of the things that surprised me. That and the Frederick Douglass thing
Yeah.
surprised me the
Yeah.
most.
That's one of the best things about history. There's always something that you didn't expect, And historians cannot predict the future because we don't know what's going to come next. And you know that well if you follow stories in history because there's always something unexpected.
Right. That's what makes it fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any more
Um,
last minute questions, Melissa?
Yeah, so we had one more question. I think it's actually a really good one. Somebody's kind of, well, we have lots of comments, and I'll say that you should definitely go look because there are a lot of people commenting, not necessarily with questions, but they're really interested in what you're saying and kind of chiming in with some of the stuff that they've been looking at and studying as well. So I totally encourage you to go
Wonderful.
look at it because I think
Yeah,
people
check out our
are
Facebook page. That's where
they're
you'll find
very
it.
excited about this topic for sure. And somebody is asking, what's next? Is there something that you had been encouraged to study some more, and what would you be working on next,
Yeah,
possibly?
well, I'm actually working on a new project, which is actually more about memorials, so more about statues and monuments. And I'm looking at, again, trying to bring together the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. And it's actually using one particular monument, the Bunker Hill Monument in Boston, Massachusetts, Charlestown, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Um, but looking at it through time, how the biography of contests over not a funeral, but in this case, a monument, can tell us something about war memorials in general and their place in American culture and memory, and using moments, including the Civil War, when the Bunker Hill Monument was a particular symbol of a particular kind for the United States. So looking at the resonance between the Revolution and the Civil War, and looking at more issues with memory and built environment, material culture. So it might be a little bit less about death. I don't know. I'm trying to, I might have plumbed that, but it probably will still have some death involved.
Yeah.
So watch for that.
Yeah, definitely keep us in the loop on that. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, that does
Thank you.
sound
I will.
fascinating.
All right, I
Great.
guess
Well,
we're at
yeah.
8 o'clock or a little past 8 o'clock. So thank you so much, everybody, for
Thank
tuning in
you.
this evening, and thank you, Sarah, for taking the time to participate this evening. It was wonderful to hear you speak, and again, I encourage everybody check out her book, Spectacle of Grief. We have it for sale on our online store. On our website, so you can pick it up there. And we are going to be continuing our Meet the Author events in 2026, and we will be coming out with a list of authors that we've lined up for 2026 in the next month or so to let you guys know what's on the horizon. So do turn to check our website, and we'll be having a list of upcoming authors for next year. So thanks again, everybody, and thank you once again, Sarah. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Good night.
Night.